So reviewing. Okay, so we'll start with we're going to talk a bit later about reviewing one's life and things like that. But first of all, kind of reviewing. Yesterday when we were talking, you told me about the first review that you'd written. So can you?
Yes, I was a student I had just begun graduate school, and it was a review of Iris Murdoch's The Sea, the Sea. I remember having fun with it. It wasn't very long, just for our student newspaper.
Right.
So, but it was, I was already at that point a complete Murdoch junkie. This was in the mid-'70s. And at that point, there was a point in my sort of undergraduate career where I read something like 22 books of hers in a row. You know, they're all kind of the same, but though it was sort of pure addiction. I was thinking recently, oh, maybe I should read one of them again and just see what they're like after all this time. But I haven't so far.
Which would it be, do you think, if you did?
Well, the one that I remember liking a lot was The Black Prince. We were talking about that yesterday. Yeah. I've also taught The Bell, which is one of her early ones, sort of modeled on a kind of religious community like Little Gidding or something, with sort of nuns and their lovers and so on.
when you did that first review, did you have any sort of sense of what role you might be playing, or role that the reviewer played, or was this just kind of a chance to write a different sort of essay for a different kind of?
I think it was sort of adolescent megalomania. No, the thing that has always inspired me writing about other writers and artists has been that I appreciate something so much about what they've done that I feel, sort of being humble and expressing that because it's often something that gets lost in the art of reviewing and the famous sort of hatchet job kind of thing, and famous reviews like of Keats and his poetry, and then Shelley and Byron thinking that he had been killed by the review of his work. There's a very sort of poignant, sometimes painful balance to be made between sort of savaging somebody's character and then praising their work. But appreciation, I think, is for me the key element. And then if I can have sort of fun with the writer's eccentricities, that is very attractive to me. I remember that Iris Murdoch and her husband, Jane Bailey, oh good, awesome. Jane Austen, her husband. So anyway, she and her husband, John Bailey, came from Oxford to Stanford, Northern California, and they'd never been there before. And they both gave little readings. And Iris Murdoch was this kind of, not cold or snobby or haughty or anything, but just sort of, in a curious way, sort of silent yet regal, to the point that you were too nervous to say, oh, I read all your novels 22 in a row, and I named my cat after you too. But I shouldn't do this. She was wearing this kind of sack-like garment. And one of my colleagues from the creative writing program sort of went over to her and picked up the shoulders and said, "Miss Murdoch, may I remove your coat?" And it was her dress. It was like she was dressed in a canvas sack or something. So, the pair of them were so eccentric. It was ravishing. It was sublime. So,
Yeah, they give eccentricity a very good name.
Yes,
Don't they?
yeah. I mean, he too.
He
so.
too. Yeah. My wife writes novels. you
Yes,
know.
right, yes.
He used to say.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think you sort of appreciation. That's the kind of keynote, isn't it? Sharing enthusiasms.
Yes.
Trying to communicate for
A passion for something.
to a reader. Obviously, not all reviews manage to do that. I think George Bernard Shaw talked about no turn unstoned as describing a certain sort of review.
I'm going to steal that.
That's quite a good line, isn't it? So, you know, have you ever received a bad review?
Yes. In the academic world, in the earlier part of my career, both of my first books were turned down and by publishers, and so I was all mopey and morbid and everything else. But I got my revenge on everyone involved afterwards. So it's like, yeah. No, I definitely had them when I was younger and starting out. And I never fit comfortably in the academic style. So I was already starting to jib.
Right.
And so I remember this reader's report coming back from this horrible rag, 18th century studies, and the reviewer had written of my article, "Who is this Terry Castle?" Almost like, what planet did she come from?
Well, they know now.
Yeah.
At least.
I did get a lot of flack, not quite the same as a review from people, but when I wrote about Jane Austen,
Right.
that
I remember
article.
that. I remember
So-
that particular essay
Yeah.
that you wrote, yes. But, I mean, part of writing anything is to stick your neck out, isn't it? So
Yeah.
it's, and not everybody's going to like it.
No.
So one of the things I love about some of the essays surrounding the professor in here are moments in them where you really come to see why a particular figure, Vera Brittain perhaps, Art Popper, means something to you. And it's often to do with your sense of their courage.
Yes, that's true. My World War I piece goes along that vein, and Vera Brittain is a central figure. But there's always, for me at least, almost invariably, some personal prompt as well.
Yes.
And in my case, it was visiting my grandmother in England, the one who was still alive, must have been the 70s. And my grandmother had lost both her brother and her fiance. And I'm actually sort of glad she lost her fiance, because otherwise I'd be some strange mutant form of myself if she hadn't married my grandfather. But in any case, I remember her telling me she was reading Testament of Youth, which is Vera Brittain's really great, unbelievable masterpiece of a memoir about working as a nurse during the First World War, both in London and then the north of France. And she also was in Malta, and their companionship with all these nurses on it was sunk in the Mediterranean, things like that. And but what struck me the most was my grandmother sitting in this little chair in her sitting room, and little tears coming down her face. She was a very quiet and unassuming woman with great dignity, not especially intellectual at all. And I sort of felt at that moment how her entire adult life had been shaped by this event.
It's a different sort of reviewing, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes,
You know,
yeah.
the corporeal review or something. Yes, the crying review.
Yeah.
Just before we move on, and I ask you to read a little bit from the professor. I'm lucky enough to co-edit a review journal here, and I would be interested in what you feel is the value of reviewing in a new media world full of blogs and tweets and instant opinion. I mean,
Right.
do you think that the sustained review still has a place for us and a value for us?
Well, I certainly hope so, else I'm shit out of luck. But no, sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
say that. Planning to get a phone call now from one of my students' parents.
But
I
only,
think,
only if you've got your cell phone on. So-
Right, yes, I know. I had to give it up, alas. But anyway, the answer is yes, because I don't think there can be too many vehicles for talking about books.
Yeah.
I mean, gosh, you know, things have been so circumscribed in the sort of literary world that used to exist. The academic criticism is so deadly, you would never want to read it unless someone was paying you to read it. So, yours accepted. But I actually have 2 blogs. One of them is visual images, and the other one is I'm a inveterate, sort of mad collector of little weird things, including vintage postcards. It actually began as a World War I postcard collection, but now I have a whole range of themes and sort of a whole book section of it devoted to Sarah Bernhardt in all of her great roles.
Yeah.
And so I'm very interested in these old images, which are often, to our eye, very camp.
Yeah.
Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, yes. I feel that the one of my own images, I don't write anything, but I do write on the postcard one. And it's like being a sort of train spotter. It's fabulous because people write to me and say, no, you're totally wrong about what you said that was in that picture.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I feel like I'm descending ever further into sort of accumulative madness. And my partner, Blakey, is very unhappy about it.
Right.
She doesn't have any closets or drawers or anything left. I've colonized them.
That might strike a chord with some people out there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that we sadly don't have much here is the sort of essay review, which you get to write in the London Review of Books, in Atlantic New Republic, and that seems to me a wonderful form.
Yes, I just think essays, hands down, that's the great form. Since the 18th century, for people who are really into writing and also run out of steam at about page 20, in my case. So all of my so-called books are actually sort of mashups of essays rather than anything, even the ones sort of pretending to be on an academic subject, the same thing. So, I feel like the essay is my form to the extent that I have one. And I think it goes back to, my original scholarly interests in the 18th century. And, Addison and Steele, but especially Samuel Johnson, my life sort of hero. So I'm starting more and more to resemble him, but I need to have a few more ticks going on. Sort of.
You'll also have to learn Dutch when you're 70.
Oh, right.
Sorry about that.
Shoot.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I will.
On that note, would you like to read us a little bit
Yes.
from Professor?
Yeah. Thank you.
This memoir, as I'm sure you all know, centers on the momentously bewildering and disastrous relationship that Terry had as a postgraduate student with an older, charismatic, and extremely manipulative female professor. And together with Terry's essays, this memoir has led to her having a very wide and enthusiastic readership outside of academia.
Oh, thank you, Harry. And tell me when I need to stop, too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right, yeah. I'm just going to read a little bit about my sort of coming out as lesbian in college. It was sort of the heyday of lesbian separatism and radical, let's castrate men times. And what was I going to say about that? Also falling in love for the first time, really, with someone in my dormitory. So I'm talking here about things that I read as a young sort of practicing sort of apprentice lesbian. By the time I was a senior in college, I felt I had lived, especially in what I imagined to be an erotic sense. Not that I'd been completely in the dark earlier. Again, several achy yet pleasurable crushes on female teachers in high school had suggested the direction things were tending. In fact, if only abstractly, I was already half cognizant, even then, of my budding sexual orientation, and took a precocious scholarly interest in it. Various grown-up literary discoveries helped to shape it. With a forwardness and frankness rare at the time, this is around 1970, for example, my 10th grade French teacher had been inspired one day to tell us the checkered story of Rimbaud and Verlaine, the tumult, the buggery, the absinthe, all of it, and I had been riveted. Not a surprise, I suppose, that said French teacher, a gamine yet severe woman we addressed as Madame Moller, was one of the main crushes. Though hailing from Omaha, she refused to speak English in our class, played Jacques Brel and Juliette Greco songs for us, and seemed unimaginably cosmopolitan, having once been an exchange student in Nice. Her Navy ensign husband was on a riverboat in Vietnam. I began devouring certain louche modern authors in secret. Gide, Wilde, Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, even Yukio Mishima, then at the height of his celebrity in the West. Sexual deviance, or at least what I conceived it to be, began to exert a certain unhallowed, even Gothic allure, a glamorous, decayed, half-satanic romance. Hesse's Damien, one of the now forgotten cult books of the era, was for some time my dark anti-Bible, not least among the attractions that such literary homosexuality proffered, some drastic deliverance from familial dreariness and the general SoCal, Southern California, strip mall stupor. In Death in Venice, after all, Aschenbach never had to go out and eat at a Carl's Jr. with Turk and the squalling step-siblings, let alone shout his fries and shake order through the tinny speaker at the drive-through window. As for homosexual practices, I confess I wasn't exactly sure, mechanically speaking, what they were. They sounded sterile and demonic, but also madly titillating. Well, I remember when Mishima, in uniform and at the head of a crazy little band of gay right-wing militarists, had himself decapitated by his homosexual lover on the balcony of the Japanese Defense Command in Tokyo in 1970. I'd read all about it, bug-eyed and agog, in my mother's Time magazine. Anything could happen, it seemed, in the fascinating world of sexual inverts. Lesbianism didn't figure much, if at all, in these early reveries. One of the oddest parts of the fantasy, I guess, was that I was male, dandified, and in some sort of filial relationship to various 1890s decadents. I knew more about green carnations, the Brompton Oratory, the Ballad of Reading Jail, and the curious charms of Italian gondoliers than I did about Willa Cather or Gertrude Stein, not to mention Garbo or Stanwyck or Dusty Springfield. Some of this obliviousness was due to the times. Lesbianism was seldom mentioned, ever, in those days, and the sparse information one did come across left more questions than it answered. I was vaguely conscious of the killing of Sister George, the notorious lesbian stage play made into an X-rated film starring Beryl Reid and Susanna York in 1968, but also bewildered by what I read about it, again, in Time magazine. It didn't seem to involve pining surreptitiously after a blonde fellow schoolboy in some oppressive yet romantic Prussian military academy. Even today, after repeated viewings, requisite because I suffer, alas, from a never-to-be-requited crush on the deceased but still super hot Coral Brown, I'm still not entirely sure I understand the bit with the cigar. Needless to say, all this inward high school preening and posturing went undisclosed. As noted, I kept no journal then, nor had I any confidant or sidekick. I wouldn't have dreamed of bringing up such intimate subjects with my somewhat addled and uncomprehending mother. Though we never discussed it, I knew that she was already worried when she had time to think about it, that was, by my bulky, ungirlish demeanor, and the fact that for some reason my period hadn't started, nor would it, mortifyingly, until I was 18. One's hormones were plainly on strike. Talking tough to management and holding out for a better deal. At the time I left for college, I had never slept with anybody or even kissed anyone, nor, when you got right down to it, could I really imagine doing so. The idea of sex with a woman, of having a lesbian lover, was simply unthinkable, like living alone at the North Pole or deciding to become a lycanthrope. Lycanthrope, yes. If the thought existed at all, it was as a mote. Sorry, I can't read anymore. It was as a mote, like a little mote of dusk. A sweet nothing, a little feather on the breath of God, barely sensed now and then, but mostly hidden away, pace Donald Rumsfeld in some dastardly psychic dossier labeled unknown unknowns. I was innocent, gruesomely so, or so that was how it seemed. All this changed in college as if someone had flipped a switch. Within a day or two of arriving at my new dormitory, I'd already met the aforementioned Phoebe, whose bare feet Joni Mitchell LPs, elaborately macrameed jeans bottoms, and well-thumbed volumes of Anais Nin's diary proclaimed her thrillingly a free spirit. She was a sort of apprentice earth mother, in fact, a Northern California hippie girl of a kind altogether unknown in right-wing San Diego, which was where I was from. Home of gray steel battleships and the myrmidons of the Pacific Fleet. Her dorm room, a short trek from mine, was a little temple to dreamy Marin County bohemianism. On her dresser, for example, next to a weird yet intriguing arrangement of pine cones, dandelion fluff, and dried seed pods, she had placed an ancient-looking copy of Leaves of Grass, several poetry books by Gary Snyder, and Kenneth Rexroth's translations from the Chinese. Her clothes were rustic, homespun, hand-sewn, nothing like the matching stretchy polyester top and pants outfit, hideously enlivened by orange and white stripes, that my mother had bought me along with a towel set and a little primitive study lamp at the Fed March just before I left for college. My mother cannot be blamed for this eye-slitting ensemble. I'd coveted the stripy top especially and had implored her to buy it for me. Didn't realize it then, of course, but the whole thing was distinctly baby butch jock. Avant la lettre, the perfect thing, and this is more of a California joke, the perfect thing in another world for the annual Dyke Shore Ladies Golf Tournament. It's actually the Dinah Shore, a ladies golf tournament in Palm Springs. Phoebe was the first person I'd ever met who'd been in the People's Park in Berkeley, had sat on the grass there, in fact, and wore Huarache sandals made out of old tires. How am I doing? Am I done?
Done.
Okay.
Great.
It gets really juicy after that. You sort of cut me off. I'd be too embarrassed to read it.
No, but if you haven't read this already, you definitely have to now. And we haven't even got to the story of the professor, which of course is the sort of centerpiece. I'll just ask a couple of kind of questions. Had you been wanting to write this memoir for a long time? Or was there something that gave you a decisive prompt to do it?
Well, I think it probably all went back to getting tenure at Stanford.
Right.
In a sense, truly, I mean, being able to write what I wanted. And I had this little kind of hidden nugget of this whole tale for years.
Yeah.
Finally just began it when I had a year's leave, and it just sort of wrote itself very easily because I don't know. It's the details that always strike me. The funny things one remembers, like when I first consummated my relationship, if that's what you want to call it, with the professor. She gave me afterwards a photograph of herself playing the guitar. She was a folk singer. She was kind of going, and it dropped on the floor, sort of my dusty apartment wooden floor. And I immediately thought, of course, ooh, bad omen.
Right.
But full forward. That's
Yeah. Yes.
So, yeah.
So, who do you feel that you were writing it for? Who? I imagine that there might have been a number of imagined readers that.
Yeah, I guess the sort of boring answer is everybody, in
Right.
part because I especially like male readers, and I actually have a kind of, I don't know, bond with several male straight friends that is actually quite transcendent often. But, you know, writing about lesbianism before, you know, the 1990s, say, or the 1890s, no, that wasn't right. It was either you were still reading Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, which came out in 1928 and had been instantly banned in Britain.
Not in the States, though.
Not in the States, and not in France, obviously. So all the copies from Jonathan Cape ended up in France and then were sold. And so that was the most dreary thing imaginable, this story of tragic lesbian. She dresses kind of like a man, and her name is Stephen, which is kind of odd. Her parents want a boy, but they call her Stephen, and so this is part of Radcliffe Hall's theory of her sexual orientation. And she's always talking, this character, about the terrible nerves of the invert and how terrible it is to be a member of the third sex with the terrible nerves of the invert. And so I thought, yeah, I know the terrible nerves of the invert. I think I'll write, but something else about it.
Yeah.
And then I sort of crashed into the early second wave of feminist writing, feminist theory in the 1970s, and with that, a lot of writing about lesbianism as a political act.
Yeah.
And for a while, I tried to fit myself into that, but I always felt like after I'd been to one of these sort of radical witches' covens or something, that I just wanted to go to a hardware store and kind of walk up and down the aisles just with the guys. And so then the other thing was, I love men. In fact, I've proposed to Harry and he's accepted. And so I had to say that. It was too good to pass up. Anyway, so I love all you guys out there. Yeah. So anyway. So I was also, but there was also an intellectual preoccupation behind it, because one of the things that bothered me in my literary training was the idea that lesbian writing, it was defined by the fact that you were a lesbian. And it seems to me that many of the great lesbian writers are in fact men, from Shakespeare perhaps to Hemingway and D.H. Lawrence and a whole bunch of them. So I wanted to make it clear, and this was what my anthology was all about, just the actual importance of the theme in writing of all kinds since the 17th century, basically.
Yep.
It all kind of began or started up again at that point with the Renaissance translations of Sappho. And so you get people like Sir Philip Sidney imitating Sappho's hymn to Aphrodite. And so there was a whole kind of researchy kind of thing behind it, but also, you know, why did D.H. Lawrence write The Fox? Why did Hemingway write a story called The Sea Change, in which it's one of his normal sort of anti-heroes sitting in a bar someplace with his lover, and then she just sort of, it's only about a page and a half long, and she sort of goes off with a woman. It's very compressed. But one of his wives was supposedly lesbian, so, and his mother too. So, yeah.
I didn't know that.
I'm just reading about Marianne Moore's mother too.
Right.
Yeah, great new biography of her. So anyway,
Right.
and I just thought, you know, it's interesting what people make of this same-sex orientation of women, and there was a lot, you know, already coming out about gay male, you know, love affairs and novels, and then the AIDS crisis started up, and so then it became very tinged with just appalling sadness, these stories, like Ed White, someone I've always enjoyed reading his writing. So it was partly a sort of public relations thing too, like, you know, here's straight people, this is what it is, kind of thing, partly. I'm sure it was obnoxious, but, well.
In the case of the professor, you had these journals that you'd kept all these years. And it did strike me that one of the people that you were writing for was that earlier self of yours.
Yes, yeah.
You know, who had a horrible, miserable, you know, life careering kind of, careening kind of sort of experience.
Sort of one depressing thing after another.
And that in a way you were sort of, as it were, reassuring that earlier version of yourself.
Yeah, it's funny, I was very conscious in that period. Actually, I had a little sort of strange fantasy of myself in some future place and time, having survived and kind of surmounted these things, which were pretty sort of run-of-the-mill in the human comedy sense, but like an unhappy family and a bigoted stepfather and suicides and all this kind of stuff, plus being unorthodox in my sexuality. And I had a fantasy of myself as an older person, sort of talking to me. And it was very helpful. It was strange, but it was sort of memorable enough that when I've had students who have been very, very upset or distressed about something, I often say to them, well, just, imagine yourself, 20 years from now, and imagine that person whom you want to be or be like, giving you a kind of encouragement emotionally or psychologically or something. So it's actually kind of uncanny that you asked me that question, because I don't know what to make of it exactly. Supernatural, I don't know.
Oh, one of the other questions that occurred to me, I've got lots of questions, but I'm aware that time is inexorably marching on. I read a lot of autobiography and memoir myself, and I love reading these. And I'm curious as to, and I take it that that's the case for you. Mm-hmm. So, what is it about reading this material that draws us, do you think?
Well, in my case, it was a sort of basic curiosity about what other people were like, especially people who had achieved something or made something beautiful or left some trace of themselves that was inspiring or frightening or just bizarre. And so it was a sort of project for getting to know humanity one by one. Right. So as I was a real misfit growing up and very solitary. And so it's never, the biography form was one of the lifelines somehow, reading about people like Gertrude Stein, for instance, in the 70s. Many biographies of her came out, and her own autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Yeah. But I think also one of maybe the magical thing about writing a memoir or an essay that's a kind of personal piece of writing, you would think, well, yes, in one sense, it's completely narcissistic and self-absorbed, because, you just have to, it takes a while to write a longish piece, and you just have to live with your old self in a sort of strange, horrible, incestuous relationship.
And all that old music.
Oh, yeah. Yes, right. Yeah. It's my party, and I'll cry if I want to. Famous lesbian Leslie Gore, she's come out. Yes, right. Yes. Anyway, but what I think it does is it's also, too, a sort of strange reaching out to readers. And in my case, readers of any kind, any sex, any age, any nationality, or whatever. And I think it can, when it's done well, it can inspire the reader to kind of create their own story, start comparing, was my family like that or not like that? And so one thing that I think happens is that autobiographies enable or even license other autobiographies. And, yes, it's self-absorbed in a way, but I also think it's great because we know so little, really, about other people in ordinary lives. So for me, it was a more acute sense of needing some sort of guidance about how to be human. And some of the things I read were inspiring, and some were cautionary tales. Juna Barnes's, for instance.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So it sort of helps us read ourselves, as it were. Or,
Yeah, yes,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm sure that, when I read autobiographies, I'm partly trying to fit my own or kind of bits and pieces,
Yes.
see if it kind of
see
fits.
if there are points of actual connection.
Yeah. And I think this is a very natural, might be narcissistic, but I think it's a very natural kind of thing to do.
Yeah.
And autobiographies and memoirs open up a space for us to do this in.
I'm coming to believe at this point a lot of these things about writing fiction and other kinds of personal nonfiction, people may hate me for saying this, but I think a lot of it is hardwired, and that it is, in fact, a kind of survival behavior that we need to know how other people function, and in some ways try to mind read. It's what the cognitive psychologists would call it. And novels have, in particular, but also lots of kinds of writing too, have they give us information in the same way that gossip does. Everybody loves gossip because whether or not they admit it, as I found when I wrote about Susan Sontag. But anyway, we need gossip and we need memoirs. They're all part of a kind of survival adaptive mechanism, I think, because other people can hurt you horribly. And, the whole career of Henry James, this is what it's about. How do you read people's comments that they make, their body language, their personal eccentricities? We need to know to survive in society somehow. So get a lot of flack for this kind of corny theory, but I think it's true.
I'm very persuaded.
Oh, good.
Okay, look, I think the moment has come to throw this open to you. So we might need a bit more light, and roving mics are around. So if you've got a question for Terry, please take the mic.
Could you comment on political correctness as you experience it in your daily working life?
It's making retirement look really good. So, yeah. I owe my good fortune in life to having been a college professor and indeed a literature professor at, a sort of Shangri-La institution, Stanford University. And I'm immensely grateful, and it's been a completely absorbing career. But I have to say, I've gotten so sick of the sort of cultural studies jargon and kind of, again, I shouldn't say this either, but the sort of left-wing self-righteousness. I shouldn't be saying this in New Zealand, because everybody's so far to the left. They're in the ocean. They're in the Tasman Sea. Is that right? Is that where they are? Yeah. So.
Tell the voters at the end of this year.
Okay. All right. Anyway, yeah. Well, more liberal than the United States, for instance. Anyway, and this kind of self-righteousness has been accompanied with this kind of theory that literary works, the only reason one would want to read them or write about them is because they expose some gross moral failing of all the rest of us, and of privilege of different kinds, whether it's class privilege or racial privilege or whatever. And all those things I'm obviously against. Sort of, yeah. No,
Yeah.
the class.
Yes.
The class one I'm a little conflicted about, but anyway.
Yeah.
So it's become its own sort of coterie phenomenon. And I think literary studies in the academy has become a very decadent phenomenon, and one that actually our students don't share at all. We're losing majors like a hemorrhage, and this is happening across all sort of literature departments in the US. And it's partly because the kids come in and, oh, right, yes, this character is like me, and oh, I love reading this book, it's so funny, though, this Gothic novel, so crazy. And but that kind of, you know, academics always say, oh, that's the naive response. But to me, there's nothing naive about it. It's the appropriate response to works of art. You know, part of political correctness, part of the whole theology of the thing, is that there's no such thing as genius. So, you know, Shakespeare is a kind of character who was invented in the 18th century as the bard, but now we all see through it as basically a huge PR campaign on the part of, you know, various Georgian plutocrats.
Yep.
And, you know, you can't say something is beautiful. You know, there's been a whole, like, beautiful is like sort of tabooed, or until very recently, oops, one thing fell off my ear. Anyway, so, and at a certain point I went along with it, because when I was a student, and indeed earlier in my career, I was quite, you know, an activist of sorts. And, but at one point I realized I believe in genius. That's where it sort of started. Some people are geniuses in the way that some people are extraordinary athletes. And at a certain point, you think about Mozart or somebody, you just have to get down on your knees and say thank you, is my view now. And beauty is like my favorite word. And so I've become increasingly disenchanted with especially the American academic world. Very sad to see this jargon spreading itself into other disciplines, like art criticism is the other area where it's suddenly become jargon central. And if you do any kind of art, you have to explain what your, you know, your practice is, and this thing and that thing. And so I've lost interest. Have gotten in a lot of arguments with colleagues over these politically correct things, especially when I was the head of my department for 3 years. And people sort of assailing me about various deficits in our department of, you know, people of different sort of diversity things, which I was doing everything I could for, but also like being a lesbian, because it was me, it wasn't considered that I was a minority, because I was just too horrible to view under that rubric. So,
I think we've got time for one more question, so...
Thank you, Terry, for... I'm over the other side. This side,
oh,
hello.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for entertaining us with your thoughts and ideas. Now, earlier on, both you and Harry alluded to Jane Austen, and I was wondering, for those of us who perhaps not had the excitement of reading what you wrote or the gossip, I was wondering if you could expand on that for us.
Sure, thank you. Very quickly, I don't consider myself a Jane Austen expert. Though I do teach her and do 18th century novels, and she sort of comes at the end.
You are.
Sometimes. But, well, no, I'm not. It's like, there's a couple of them I haven't read for so long. I hope no one will ask me about them. But anyway, I was asked by the LRB to write a review of a collection of Austen's letters, a very scholarly production, with all kinds of apparatus and everything. Very, very good piece of research. And it's very difficult because there are not very many Austen letters. Her sister Cassandra burnt most of her private papers when she died. And so we know very, very little about Austen herself, surprisingly, for a person of the time. And so the letters shed some light. And they're actually not that interesting, you know, unless you're interested in the sort of scholarly ins and outs. There a lot of them very perfunctory. Though there are some funny jokes she has here and there. But I started thinking about her relationship with Cassandra, who was her elder sister. And Cassandra and Jane were like this. And then there were a lot of brothers who were all, you know, the Navy officers in Persuasion. Anyway, so I started to think about them and the emotional intimacy that comes across when one reads about this relationship. They slept in the same bed often. Cassandra was there when Austen died. And so I had raised, in a sort of speculative, scholarly way, an idea that, you know, this emotional bond was very like the kinds of female relationships you see before Freud and the whole kind of sort of open writing about sexuality. It reminded me of some of these things. And a lot of these were sort of female couples, and it was never known whether they had done it or not. But if you're lesbian, you think, oh, yeah, sure they did, yeah. Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorraine Hickok, yeah, sure. Anyway, Dusty Springfield, yeah. But it was a real historical question because a lot of the theory or the history of sexuality was then, this was by the 90s, so-called queer theory. All of these things were very hot academic topics. And so I didn't feel like I was saying anything particularly outlandish about this. And there actually are relationships from around the time of Austen between women that are documented as sexual relationships. The Diaries of Anne Lister had just appeared in England, and they are extraordinary. She was Austen's exact contemporary. Anyway, so I wrote this thing. The LRB gave it the title, which they ran across the top of the front of the magazine, Was Jane Austen Gay? So I was immediately sort of stalked by every deranged Jane Austen fan in the world. Every sentimental Janeite was flailing me, and it was in the press, and they got all these letters at the LRB. How dare she say, well, first of all was, how dare he? And the number of times I've been confused as a man. I don't know why that is, but no, it's my name. This woman wrote in, why did you ever let this man, Terry Castle, write this just scurrilous, scandalous, you know, thing about Austen and her sister being lesbians? The funny thing was, I always thought as it was going on, well, if that had been the case, it would also be incest. But nobody ever talked about the incest. It's like, well, it's incest too. And this woman wrote in, how dare you, etc. And the editors of the LRB, I think they got a huge kick out of it because it was in the British papers and the Daily Mail and everything.
Everywhere.
And it was my breakthrough piece. Yeah. So the woman, they had written this little thing, well, it may help you to know, or something, that Terry Castle is actually a woman. So this woman writes back again to them saying, no, she's not. You said in your own press release, Terry Castle is a man. And so it descended into levels of such deep craziness that I'm forever grateful to the magazine for their title.
Okay.